When we consider how to solve in this case study, how to solve for least restrictive environment, we need to regroup, likely get more data, and make sure that we're including all of the important stakeholders, especially the family, and in this case, the student in that data collection, considerations, and discussions. First and foremost, as a teacher, a parent, or an administrator in this situation, I'd want to know more about their lack of continuum of services. I'm not comfortable with a situation in which a school or staff member says, we only have resource programming. We don't have that program that you need here in this public school system. That's a huge red flag, and that's going to be a problem, and it could likely go to a state complaint or farther. So we need to solve for that and get more data and find out what's going on there. The rest of what we consider for solutions in this case study, and to make sure we're doing best practice for least restrictive environment, would be to follow some of the recommendations in our reading from the IRIS info brief this week. We need to go back through and make sure that we are truly individualizing for this student. Are we forcing this student through a curriculum, an online curriculum, a scripted, a pretty tight curriculum? Are there unrealistic expectations for behavior in any of the settings? We need to make sure that we've made individualized decisions and data-based and gathered data based on that. We also need to take a look at the benefit to the student. Lots of times, placements that are more restrictive are made in this category. Is the student miserable in this setting? And that's why he or she is exhibiting these behaviors. What is the social emotional benefit for the student? What is the ed benefit for the student? And how can we use the social model and build a setting that is appropriate and beneficial for that student? We also have to consider the effect on his or her peers. There's obviously a safety issue here, and it might take a temporary placement, temporary extra staff, temporary more aids and services that can then be scaffolded or gently provided on a scaled basis after we get some of the behaviors under control. But that's an obvious and absolutely a factor in the decisions and the data that we gather and the decisions that we make. We also need to make sure that we have the appropriate setting and inclusive practices. Are we at the right balance? Do we have a student in an appropriate, restrictive or not restrictive situation in which they can make progress and still have access to general education? The balance there is a key way to say that. Texts, articles, and research are showing that very few cases are an argument for full inclusion, but we have to make sure we've considered all data. We've made sure we've had all the discussions and documented everything to prove that we're at the best, most beneficial balance for the student, the stakeholders, and all of the students in the program or school. We also need to make sure we've maxed out those supplementary aids and services. Are we moving the student before we've provided everything we can provide? I would hold up the social work hours as an example for that in this case. We've never increased social work services for this student, or barely increased social work services for this student, and yet we continue to make more restrictive decisions on their placement. I'm not saying that social work services are the magic bullet that are going to take care of all these problems, but it shows that we don't perhaps have all of the data that we need, and we have not maxed out and provided all of the supplemental aids and services that we possibly can. I'm going to add one here and also make sure that when we look at solutions and action steps for this case, that we provide a timeline for review. And I don't mean the yearly IEP in this case. We would need to review this case and review this data and these discussions as often as possible when both behaviors are a problem and when we get to the point where the balance is correct and the student is successful. And with that, I guess what I'm really saying there is that a restrictive placement shouldn't always be a restrictive placement. Once we get to the right balance and we get to a point where a student is making progress and the behaviors and social emotional supports are in place, we do need to always consider if we can increase the access back into general education or make the environment less restrictive. And I'm saying baby steps. I don't mean fix it in isolation and put them right back in a situation where they weren't successful. But what can we do to always be considering the next least restrictive environment for a student and how we could possibly get there and make sure they're still having benefit from their education, benefit for students and staff around them, and appropriate for that individualized student's need.